This is the first of two videos where we look at the Adams administration, meaning the presidency of the second president of the United States, John Adams. And yeah, it might seem like a spoiler, but not too big of a surprise. Now, 1796. He's been trying for a while, but after two terms, George Washington is truly determined to leave the presidency once and for all. And at this point, we call this the first openly contested election or the first real election. First two elections we had, it's no secret who's going to win. It's going to be Washington. But now, all of a sudden, we have a true contest. Now, the two candidates that are going to emerge are Vice President John Adams and former Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson for the Republicans, because Jefferson had resigned by this point. Now, Thomas Pinckney is the Federalist candidate for the vice presidency, which is why you see T. Pinckney getting votes. And Aaron Burr becomes the Republican candidate for vice president. And this was back when each elector cast 2 total votes for the presidency. Alexander Hamilton, former Treasury Secretary, is actually working behind the scenes to drum up support for Pinckney, because Pinckney is someone he can more easily control. This causes Adams to really lose respect for him, and he doesn't want to deal with him the rest of his political career. Doesn't want to deal with Hamilton. Now we can see the end results. As vice president and head of the Senate, John Adams was personally responsible for counting the votes. Apparently, there were discrepancies in Georgia's ballots. This was well known. So Adams paused and waited for Jefferson's supporters to protest. This never happened. So he was rightfully elected president by 3 electoral votes. And Jefferson apparently said something to the effect that, yeah, he knew there were contested ballots, but he wasn't going to let a few pieces of paper hold up the fate of the nation. Now, to try and rise above these rival factions that are occurring, we see Federalists, we see Republicans starting to split. Jefferson was to write a letter to Adams expressing his willingness to work with him. Adams wanted to bring Jefferson into the fold, show that they truly could rise above rival factions. Jefferson showed his letter to James Madison, and Madison told him that he could not put the interests of his nation above the interest of his party. So Jefferson never sent that letter. And when you look at the record, Jefferson is basically going to spend the next 4 years going against his boss. He's going to spend 4 years really going against his president. All right, so there's 2 issues that need to be dealt with. Now, the XYZ affair, it becomes domestic, but this is really a foreign issue. There was a foreign issue, there was a domestic issue for Adams. Now, by the Adams presidency, Napoleon Bonaparte has risen in France, and he's been given control of all military forces. His armies have swept through Europe and into Egypt. And this is the basis of why the French are stopping U.S. ships going to trade with Britain, because we have that most favored nation deal that came about as a result of Jay's Treaty. France is at war with Britain. They can't let us aid the enemy. So 3 individuals, Charles Pinckney, Elbridge Gerry, and future Chief Justice John Marshall, are sent to negotiate with Foreign Minister Talleyrand. And they were made to wait for several days, and they got 15 minutes time. What ends up occurring is 3 agents had periodically approached our diplomats and demanded $250,000. They demanded $250,000 to open talks. $250,000 just to open the talks, and a personal loan of $10 million to compensate for the supposed insults that Adams had made against France in a speech. Now, eventually, all of these diplomatic messages are released to the public. In the official diplomatic cables, in the diplomatic correspondence, the three French agents were referred to as Agents X, Agent Y, and Z. That's where XYZ Affair comes from. Now, these are all released to the public, and the common phrase becomes millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. This leads to the U.S. seizing French ships in retaliation and suspending trade. Now, all told, this leads to preparations for war. But Adams didn't really want it because he believed we weren't ready, and he was correct. However, he did preside over the creation of a new Department of the Navy. So now there's a separate Department of the Navy that's underneath the War Department. Napoleon wanted American neutrality. He wanted us to stay neutral. He didn't want it to get us, get on our bad side, because he wanted to use the new Louisiana territory he had acquired as a base for a North American empire. So this quasi-war at sea, where each nation is taking the other's ships, we both want it to end, and we don't want it to end in war. So the Convention of 1800 is held, and you can see the end result. The French alliance is over, and France gets most favored nation status. So in terms of foreign affairs, XYZ Affair is the biggie. That's the main issue with the French that Adams dealt with. The issue that was completely at home, this is where XYZ becomes domestic, because our squabbles with France will spill over into the United States. Amidst the chaos of all this and the anger over the actions of France, Adams did feel like he needed to take what were called wartime actions, even though he didn't want a legitimate war. For increased numbers of French and even increased numbers of Irish in the United States, the French diplomat in Philadelphia estimated that there were 25,000 French refugees in the United States. And this was divided between wealthy aristocrats who had fled France during the Revolution. There was an event called the Reign of Terror where aristocrats were targeted. So half of them were those people. And the other half were those who fled the slave uprisings in modern-day Haiti. The nation of Haiti is the result of the most successful slave result in history. And French aristocrats had fled that. Now, there were also French agents operating within the United States. So there was that fear. In addition to the French, there were increased numbers of Irish who had fled following a rebellion in 1798. And these Irish immigrants tended to support Republicans because the Republicans had anti-British ideology. So in effect, these laws kind of become anti-Republican and, in a sense, anti-Catholic, because France and Ireland are both traditional Catholic nations. Now, the Alien and Sedition Acts. We see numbers 1, 2, and 3, because it's a series of 4 laws to deal with treason. The first one, the president can deport anyone dangerous. Anyone he deems dangerous with no trial. And there's a 6 because this violates the 6th Amendment, right to a trial by jury of your peers. Interestingly enough, President Adams never invoked this law. He never used this first law, even though his Secretary of State really egged him on and tried encouraging him to use it. Laws 2 and 3 All right, laws 2 and 3 increased the wait time to become a citizen. It was 5 years, now it's 14. The final law deals with sedition, and we can see in the cartoon here sedition bills. Sedition means you're trying to incite a rebellion. And honest opinion, free speech, free press are being attacked by the sedition snake because this law deprived citizens the right to criticize the federal government or the president. Interestingly, by the wording of it, they couldn't criticize the president, they couldn't criticize Congress. It said nothing about criticizing the vice president, which was a member of the opposition party. This flies in the face of the First Amendment, but many Federalists, including Adams, deem it to be a wartime measure. It certainly is a clear ploy to attack the editors of Republican newspapers that were publishing anti-Federalist perspectives. One of the individuals who was jailed was Benjamin Franklin Bash, grandson of Benjamin Franklin. There was even a congressman from Vermont who was jailed on sedition charges. He won re-election from jail. His constituents re-elected him while he was serving time. So this is a real hostile moment in American history. We have issues with France overseas with the XYZ Affair, and that leads to issues in the United States and laws that do seem to violate parts of the Bill of Rights, which had been the Republican fear of big government all along.